Have you ever questioned why many African governments and bureaucratic systems struggle to function effectively, even though they inherited well-structured administrative frameworks at independence? Why is it that numerous African administrations begin with optimism, strong public support, and international goodwill, only to falter over time, even when supported by external partners? The answer is complex and multifaceted, but at its core lies a fundamental tension between two powerful forces: principles and culture. At first glance, principles and culture may appear to be similar concepts, yet they differ significantly in their scope and application. Principles are typically internalized guidelines that govern an individual's conduct. They are personal standards of behavior, rules that one chooses to follow in decision-making and action. Culture, on the other hand, extends beyond the individual and operates at a collective level. It encompasses shared beliefs, traditions, norms, and practices that define a group of people. While principles guide individuals, culture shapes communities. Culture is often rooted in a shared history and is usually tied to specific groups of people, often defined by ethnicity, language, or geographical origin. For example, a particular cultural system may be dominant within a defined region where people share ancestry and social practices. However, culture is not entirely fixed to geography. Due to migration, whether for economic, educational, or social reasons, cultural practices can spread beyond their original locations. Even so, such movement can dilute or transform those practices over time. In Africa, this dynamic has been particularly evident. Urbanization, globalization, and economic pressures have contributed to shifts in cultural expression. Additionally, the influence of westernization has played a significant role. Many young Africans, especially in urban areas, increasingly adopt Western ways of thinking and behaving, sometimes placing them above traditional cultural norms. That said, this trend is not universal. In many parts of southern Africa, for instance, cultural traditions remain deeply respected and are preserved through ceremonies and designated cultural observances throughout the year. Although principles may seem subordinate to culture, since they are individually held while culture is collectively enforced, they are not necessarily in conflict by default. In fact, they can coexist and even reinforce one another. For instance, a principle might dictate that certain preparatory steps must be followed before performing a cultural ritual. If those steps are not observed, the ritual itself may be considered invalid. This illustrates how principles can operate within the framework of culture. It is important to distinguish between culture and custom. While closely related, they are not identical. Culture refers to the broader system of shared beliefs and values, whereas customs are the specific practices and rituals that express that culture. Based on this understanding, Africa can rightly be described as a continent with deeply rooted cultural systems, many of which existed long before the arrival of colonial powers. However, it is precisely the interaction between these long-standing cultural systems and externally introduced principles that has created tension. This tension has had profound implications, particularly in the realms of leadership, governance, and accountability. To fully grasp this conflict, one must look at how African societies were organized prior to colonial rule. Before the late 19th century, many African communities functioned on communal principles. Authority was often decentralized, and leadership structures were embedded in tradition. Interestingly, this communal way of life was not unique to Africa. Similar systems existed in parts of Europe as well. The year 1884 marked a turning point with the Berlin Conference, where European powers formally divided Africa among themselves. This event transformed European involvement in Africa from sporadic interaction into systematic control. The driving force behind this expansion was the Industrial Revolution in Europe, which created an enormous demand for raw materials. The Industrial Revolution also reshaped European societies, introducing rigid class structures and new modes of production. It required discipline, efficiency, and adherence to strict schedules. Workers were expected to operate within clearly defined systems, with time management and productivity becoming essential. From this environment emerged the principle that consistent effort and adherence to rules would result in economic reward. When Europeans extended their influence into Africa, they brought these principles with them. Their approach to colonization often began with religious missions, followed by political control and the establishment of administrative systems. Through these structures, Africans were introduced to new ways of organizing society, systems that emphasized order, accountability, and institutional governance. Missionaries and colonial administrators promoted values such as honesty, discipline, and integrity. Africans were taught that adherence to these principles was essential for functioning within the new systems. However, while these lessons were taught, they were not always fully internalized or integrated into existing cultural frameworks. Many Africans adapted outwardly to colonial rule but retained their traditional views internally. When independence came, African nations inherited these administrative systems. There was widespread optimism. The expectation was that Africans, now free from foreign control, would use these systems to govern effectively and advance their societies. Infrastructure such as roads, railways, and public institutions had already been established. Political and economic frameworks were in place. The future seemed promising, yet, reality proved more complicated. While colonialism brought development in certain areas, it also created deep structural and political challenges. It imposed foreign systems without fully reconciling them with indigenous cultures. As a result, post-independence leaders were tasked with managing systems that were not entirely aligned with the societies they governed. To illustrate this tension, consider a hypothetical example. In the heart of Africa lies a small town called Ebeloe in Cameroon. It falls within a geographical region dominated by the Bakundu people, an ethnic group deeply rooted in strong cultural values, where political authority is vested in a council of elders. From this setting emerges a 28-year-old man named Nambo Ngo, a young man with political aspirations. However, his ambitions do not lie within the traditional leadership structures of his people, where becoming a tribal leader requires adherence to established cultural channels. Instead, Nambo sets his sights on higher, national political office. To achieve this, he turns to a system established by the French, the former colonial rulers of his country. Nambo understands that he cannot rise to the highest levels of national leadership without first joining a registered political party. With this in mind, he approaches an official of the Cameroon People's Democratic Movement, CPDM, a party known for its activism, particularly among the youth. His oratory skills quickly distinguish him. Senior party officials are impressed by his deep understanding of both party and national issues, as well as his ability to articulate solutions to complex problems. As a result, he is recommended for a position within the party's executive committee. During subsequent party elections, Nambo is nominated and endorsed by delegates. In time, he rises to become the Secretary General of the party. In this role, he provides significant support to the party president, contributing to the party's success in the national general elections held a few years later. Nambo continues to work tirelessly, and his dedication earns him the opportunity to contest for the position of vice chairman. This places him within striking distance of becoming vice president of the country, should his party win the next election cycle. By this stage, Nambo is 43 years old. Years of dedication have paid off. He reflects on his journey with a sense of pride and optimism for the future. The following year, national elections are held, and his party is returned to power, albeit without a landslide victory. Nambo becomes vice president, effectively making him second in command of his country, an achievement earned through persistence and hard work. In this new role, he begins to fully grasp the challenges faced by his fellow citizens. He recalls the dusty roads of Ebeloe that need to be paved, his mother's friend who once walked barefoot for 7 kilometers to reach the only hospital while carrying her baby, and the young boy who would knock on his door every morning at 7 o'clock selling bean cakes, known locally as koki chereng, just to feed himself and his family. A deep sense of responsibility settles within him. Now, with access to power and resources, he believes he can make meaningful changes in his home region. After all, he is part of the government. However, within a year, unexpected developments arise. The party is informed that its leader, who is also the president of the country, is in poor health. Although the president remains in office, he is unable to effectively carry out his duties. In accordance with constitutional provisions, he appoints Nambo as acting leader while he seeks medical treatment abroad. Due to his prolonged absence and limited direct engagement with the realities on the ground, despite receiving regular briefings, the president eventually decides to resign. Nambo is suddenly elevated to the highest office in the land, sworn in during a brief but joyful ceremony. At last, he believes, real change can begin. But this expectation soon proves to be misguided. Nambo begins to reflect on his time as vice president and the troubling patterns he observed. He recalls how individuals frequently bypassed his office, going directly to the president to secure contracts, appointments, and other personal favors, many of which violated national laws. He realizes that the depth of corruption within the government is far greater than he had initially understood. Despite these challenges, governance must continue. Nambo appoints a new vice president and reshuffles his cabinet, dismissing several officials appointed by his predecessor whom he considers ineffective due to age or incompetence. He installs trusted allies in key positions, hoping to implement his vision for development. However, the entrenched culture of bypassing institutional processes quickly resurfaces. Requests for favors continue to flood the president's office. Worse still, he receives reports that members of his cabinet are involved in illicit smuggling activities across the border with Equatorial Guinea. Faced with mounting pressure, Nambo hesitates to take decisive action. He fears public backlash, the potential withdrawal of international donor support, and the perception of weak leadership. Gradually, he begins to abandon his strong pro-people stance. Meanwhile, parliamentary commissions are established to hold government officials accountable. Their proceedings are widely broadcast on radio and television, and their recommendations, some calling for the dismissal of ministers, are made public. Yet, no action is taken. Eventually, President Nambo Ngo himself becomes implicated in a fraudulent procurement deal. He is found to have signed off on documents without proper due diligence, resulting in a loss of approximately $5 million, an amount the country can ill afford. When a parliamentary committee recommends impeachment proceedings, Nambo turns inward, reflecting on his cultural roots. In his traditional Bukundu society, authority is rarely questioned. Gradually, he begins to equate his position as president with that of a traditional ruler. He convinces himself that, like the leaders of his people, he stands above scrutiny. He begins to believe that his authority is absolute, that he possesses power beyond the reach of the law. In his mind, he is no longer just a political leader but something greater, a figure untouchable by the system he is meant to uphold. This shift in mindset leads to dangerous consequences. Nambo fosters a culture of impunity within the government, particularly among officials who share his ethnic background. Many support him, knowing that his downfall could mean the loss of their own positions. As a result, governance deteriorates. Corruption becomes entrenched. Institutions weaken. Over time, the country faces severe economic challenges, many of which persist for decades and remain unresolved to this day. Nevertheless, Nambo remains in power as president, even at a very advanced age, presiding over failed institutions and a general sense of hopelessness from his compatriots. This scenario reflects a broader pattern observed in many African countries. Cultural perceptions of authority often conflict with institutional principles of accountability. In many traditional systems, leaders are revered and not openly challenged. However, modern governance requires transparency, checks and balances, and the ability to hold leaders accountable. When these two frameworks collide, culture often takes precedence. Leaders may prioritize personal or communal loyalty over national duty. Public resources may be used for private gain. Institutions designed to enforce accountability may be undermined. This is not to suggest that culture is inherently problematic. Rather, the issue lies in the failure to harmonize cultural values with institutional principles. Without this alignment, governance systems become ineffective. Like Nambo, the idea of an authority figure being questioned or summoned by subordinates is often considered unacceptable, whereas in Western systems, such actions are viewed as both appropriate and necessary. It is this kind of mindset that has contributed to the misuse and depletion of financial resources in many African countries for personal gain. In many cases, Western governance principles are selectively applied, primarily to shield those responsible for embezzling public funds from legal consequences, including prosecution and imprisonment. At times, there is even an open undermining of institutions tasked with upholding constitutional order and accountability. This pattern has been evident over time in countries such as Nigeria, particularly during the rule of Sani Abacha, as well as in South Africa during the presidency of Jacob Zuma and even under his successor's administration. Similar situations have occurred elsewhere across the continent. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, the family of Joseph Kabila accumulated significant wealth through the diversion of public funds from national projects. In Malawi, the 2013 Cashgate scandal during the presidency of Joyce Banda exposed the embezzlement of approximately $250 million, made possible by vulnerabilities in the government's electronic payment system. Unfortunately, such practices may persist into the future, as those responsible often face little to no meaningful consequences. The consistent failure to enforce accountability has allowed corruption to become deeply entrenched, almost normalized, across much of the continent. In contrast, other parts of the world demonstrate a stronger adherence to principles over personal considerations. In some societies, even minor infractions can lead to public apologies or resignations. Leaders are expected to take responsibility, regardless of circumstances. On March 6, 2026, a Japanese minister was captured on video rushing from a taxi into a building that also houses the Prime Minister's office. The 43-year-old minister, Kimi Onoda, had arrived 5 minutes late for a meeting. Her delay was caused by a highway accident that disrupted traffic, making it impossible for her to arrive on time. Despite this, within Japanese culture, such explanations are not considered sufficient. During a press briefing, Onoda did not attempt to justify her lateness. Instead, she issued a public apology to the entire nation. This highlights a clear contrast with many African contexts. In Japan, lateness is viewed as a sign of disrespect toward those one is meeting, even if the delay is only a few minutes. This expectation goes beyond workplace etiquette. It is a deeply ingrained societal principle where collective responsibility takes precedence over individual circumstances. As a result, leaders are expected to model discipline and influence the behavior of others. Similarly, in established democracies, leaders have resigned over scandals or political failures. These actions reinforce the principle that no individual is above the system. Institutions remain stronger than the individuals who occupy them. In the United States, President Richard Nixon resigned in August 1974 following the Watergate scandal. In the United Kingdom, former Prime Minister David Cameron stepped down after the Brexit referendum in June 2016. More recently, in October 2025, French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu resigned due to political deadlock and the absence of a parliamentary majority, an issue far less severe than the misappropriation of public funds. The contrast highlights a key difference. In systems where principles are firmly embedded in institutions, accountability is consistent. In systems where authority is personalized, accountability becomes optional. In many African contexts, the latter tends to prevail. Authority is often tied to individuals rather than institutions. When conflicts arise between personal interests and institutional rules, the individual frequently takes precedence. This dynamic has significant implications. It undermines governance, weakens public trust, and hinders development. Without accountability, corruption thrives. Without strong institutions, progress becomes unsustainable. Lastly, it should be made clear that the challenges facing African governance cannot be attributed to a single cause. However, the tension between cultural norms and institutional principles plays a central role. While Africa possesses rich cultural traditions, these must be carefully integrated with modern governance systems. For meaningful progress to occur, there must be a deliberate effort to strengthen institutions while respecting cultural identity. Principles such as accountability, transparency, and rule of law must be upheld consistently, regardless of who holds power. Ultimately, sustainable governance requires a balance, where culture informs identity but principles guide leadership. Only then can systems function effectively and deliver on the promise that accompanied independence. So, do you believe this provides a clear explanation for why many challenges in Africa continue, even with Western-style systems of governance in place across the continent? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this.